Hello, my name's Olurotimi Osha. Um, Today is March the 26th, 2026, and I've been reminiscing of my time growing up in Lagos. I loved growing up in Lagos in Nigeria. It's a huge cosmopolitan area, and it's one of the largest cities in the world. I think, the population is roughly 20 million or so. And so I loved it there. Of course, I didn't live in the heart of the city. I guess I lived in what in America you'd call a residential area, the suburbs or something. Residential area, what Americans would call the suburbs, right? Um, but many people I've noticed many people in America when they talk about uh, Nigeria, they often express nightmares growing up in Lagos, talking about how they had to walk 20 miles to go to school barefooted. They had to read by candlelight, tread on snakes and scorpions, on the way and dodge bullets from kidnappers and armed robbers, and I don't know. Many people, of course, sensationalize their stories in order to get into a school, you know create the sort of attention, uh, to get their foot in the door somewhere. um Maybe some of them do have these true tales, but yes, we did have to dodge the checkpoints, and I did have to dodge checkpoints as well, particularly especially since I owned my own car, since I was a teenager. So I was one of those people. I mean, there are many people like that, but I had my car 24/7, so it was mine. I was very fortunate since I was a teenager. Um, but there are those notorious checkpoints we had in Lagos, especially, and so there's a reason why I'm often very concerned about cops. I don't like cops, right? And I guess that's from a childhood experience. The fact that cops, brutally uh, murdered my childhood friend, and then to add insult to injury, they defamed him. It was an innocent man. It was just a boy at the time. It was just a teenager, and it was such a brutal way. So this story is a bit graphic, um, but I guess it gives some kind of understanding, especially, and just some kind of idea with respect to how my family feels, knowing that my childhood friend was brutally murdered by cops, although in Nigeria. And so I was raised in a way to be very, 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 very cautious of cops, knowing that cops can just murder you and lie. Now, I was fortunate that I was not murdered, but they attempted to kill me in my home. But of course, they lied. They did the injury, the defamation part. But that's easy for me to deal with. God saved me from their attempted murder. I think what shocked me, though, and what's shocking for my family is the fact that it was cops in America after I'd spent over 20 years without any issue with cops in America. And it happened in my own home, and they were the the murder attempt, the defamation, the dehumanization, the violation of my human rights, my dignity, my constitutional rights, was orchestrated by and instigated by a man who was impersonating himself, saying he was my uncle, right? A crazy man that my mother hasn't talked to for 40 years, over 40 years, because of the way he defamed, the way he abused, um, the way he abused my aunt. her sister. He abused her, and no, this guy's not my uncle. I'm not blood related to him. Nobody in my family knows him or talks to him. Nobody, right? There's no interaction. He's been here in America since '77. And I was not living in his home. I was living in my home. But that's not the story I'm going to talk about today. I survived the assassination attempt by Montgomery County Police and Jide and the rogue agents that they were in part, the rogue agents from the Department of the Navy, Department of Defense, that orchestrated the whole swatting um, with Jide and Montgomery County Police. In any event, so many years ago, under the military dictator we had, General Sani Abacha, um, his regime was very focused on eliminating crime in Nigeria. So, in order to eliminate, the spate of robberies and in especially Lagos, huge cities like Lagos, um, he established all these checkpoints, right? Police checkpoints, and with military as well, all over Lagos. But these checkpoints, typically they were abused by the cops to obtain bribes, to get bribes, and because the salaries of cops or just general government workers generally, was meager, right? Probably wasn't enough to feed their families. I don't know, but the thing is, they used the checkpoints as a means of extorting, um, Nigerians, people who were driving in cars, people just passing through, even pedestrians. They used it as a means to extort and basically they were terrorizing Nigerians. Um, they may have, maybe some of us, maybe we should have considered that, well, they also felt that they were doing a service to us, since they were endangering their lives, uh, mounting these posts to um, to fight and apprehend armed robbers or keep them at bay. And so maybe they expected that Nigerians would be able to empathize with their conditions and reward them with bribes or tips. As people tip waiters and servers in America. So maybe they expected they felt entitled to these tips, instead of calling them bribes. But in Nigeria, we had a name for it. It was called Egunje in Yoruba, my Yoruba language. It's called Egunje, but um, Egunje. That's like not necessarily a bribe, but just like some kind of token, some kind of recognition money, right? That you actually, I'd call it a bribe, right? So Egunje, that's what we called it back then. Now, one night when I was still really young, I was probably about 17, I was 18 or so, 17 or 18. My childhood best friend knocked on my door. It was like midnight. Came knocking on my door. No, it wasn't midnight yet. Maybe it was like 10. He was knocking on my door. And, he came and he told me that he told me what had happened. Um, at the time, um, our mutual friend, right? Our mutual friend was actually my family friend as well. So we all grew up in the same neighborhood, right? Our homes were far from each other. But it's interesting, my childhood friend, whom I've known since I was 6, right? I got to know him because I talked to my best friend was my childhood friend since 6 as well. I got to know him because of our dads. Our dads sort of were friends, knew each other, and so I was invited to their birthday. I mean, he lived right across from me, And so ever since we became best friends, since six, we're still best friends still today. I wouldn't even, he's more than my best friend. He's like my brother, his siblings, his sibling went to school with me here in America. We were in the same class here in America, and so um, they're like brothers. So um, so he came to tell me something about um, an encounter with the cops, right? That he sort of he witnessed another childhood friend, and I don't want to, I don't know if I should say my, I'm not going to say, I'm not going to call my childhood friend's name, right? By the way, this thing is it's recorded, it was reported to the United Nations, so it's public. The United Nations made it public, so it was in the papers. I'm not going to say his name. I'm going to give him another name. um no, I'll say his name. Let his name always live forever. His name is Bola. His name was Bola. I won't say his last name, not to offend his family. Um, he came and he told me what had happened. He said he had been driving his car. So my childhood friend, he drove a car as well. He had cars, regular cars. He drove it from his own. So he was driving his car, and he was driving home, and he had his um our Bola's sister in his car. He had Bola's sister in his car, and Bola was in another car. I think they call that vehicle Daewoo back then. I remember. I think my friend was in a Peugeot 505, while I was in a Daewoo. It was a brand new Daewoo. Um, so he was in another car, and the cops had stopped him in front. Right, he was in another car, and he had girls in his car. Like, we're all friends. We all knew each other growing up, and they were going somewhere, right? They were going for an event, maybe some kind of like little party, a pepper soup joint. I think that was what was popular, just somewhere. And so the cops stopped them. So the pretext for the cops stopping you is typically to check your documentation, to make sure the documentation in the car, is in order, and then there's nothing untoward going on, right? So, but that's a pretext. So it became routine, it became MO, right? That uh, when you stop at a checkpoint, it's not supposed to be delayed. There isn't supposed to be any delay. You immediately give the police a gunje. It's in a you in a bald fist, right? And you just hand him the gunja. The money's in your hand, and you just hand it to him immediately. No checking of papers, no nothing. But Paula wouldn't do this, right? Apparently, this was what my friend told me. Paula wouldn't do this, and Paula, it's because he sat in his car, and the cop went through the motions, expecting that okay, before long, he would just do the obvious and hand him over some money. So the cop asked for his documents, documents for the vehicle, and my friend handed over the documents, gave him all the documents, right? And of course, the cop was now frustrated, and he exasperated. He just exclaimed, it came out with it. It was open that okay, this is why I'm really here. I'm expecting you to give me a gunja, right? Give me a bribe, give me some money. But my friend, didn't say anything. He just gave him his papers. He didn't say anything. He didn't respond. He didn't say anything. But the cop apparently went ballistic, right? Was very enraged, and he thought that my friend was being proud and was refusing to just give him some money, or he thought he was looking down. My friend didn't do anything. By the way, my friend was very idealistic, right? He was a young guy. He was at university. He was at a very good university at that time, and he was studying economics, right? So he was a very idealistic kid, and You know, back then everybody thought, of course, now I've lived in America and I've learned that, well, there's corruption in America as well, there's bribery in America as well. But back then, growing up in Nigeria, we all thought that growing up under a military dictatorship was the most horrible thing that anybody who wants progress, anybody who wants liberty could experience. And we thought that that was the only sort of political system that was corrupt, right? But so this was how my friend felt then, and he thought he was just playing his role by refusing to bribe government officials or public servants, right? Because a cop was a public servant. So the cop started insulting Bola. Bola didn't flinch. He didn't say anything. The cop started threatening Bola about, hey, you know what, oh, you think you're the only one who's rich, because he was driving a brand new car, right? A nice car, brand new car. Was a kid. He was saying, oh, you think your dad's rich, you think you're the only one who's a son of a rich man. The cop was talking about how he too was the son of a rich man, that he's just doing this job because it's a man. But the cop now became hostile, and then started making threats, and he said, look, he promises he's going to deal with my friend. He's going to deal with him. Now you wait and see. I'm going to deal with you. He was issuing these threats. So this was what my friend Mickey, my best friend, this is what he was telling me. He came over to my home and he was telling me this, that look, his cop was promising to deal with him, right? He was going to deal with him. So, uh, but little did we know, my so one of the reasons why I guess my best friend's always been my best friend is also because, one, he's very funny. I like funny people. He used to make, well, outside he's very cool. He's very reserved. Like if he doesn't know you, right? My best friend is like a cool dude. Like outside he has this cool demeanor, but if he's close to you, people he's close to, like me, he's like Eddie Murphy. By the way, he looks like, he's like, I used to think I thought of him as a carbon copy of Eddie Murphy when we were growing up. He looked just like Eddie Murphy. And so he was very funny like Eddie Murphy. He liked Eddie Murphy. He dressed like Eddie Murphy. He was a very cool guy, my best friend. So he would make fun, he knew how to mimic people. And so he was mimicking the cop. He found it hysterical, right? But the way the cop was agitating and really angry just because, this kid didn't want to give him a bribe. And so he was like, hey, telling me about how the cop was saying, hey, I'm gonna deal with you. I'm gonna deal with you. You think it's only you that your father's rich. Using Nigerian vernacular. I'm gonna deal with you. I'm gonna deal with you. Blah 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 blah. What's going on. So my friend was showing all the gestures, and my friend was laughing. As he was expressing, was telling me what happened. So it was done though. But my friend seriously told me the reason he came to tell me was that, look, hey man, they just narrowly escaped, right, death. He was upset. He was like saying, look, man, these Nigerian cops are not worth it. They can kill you. That cop was really angry. And my friend, there are some people who have this additional sense, and they can sense danger. Because it was unusual that my friend came to report, because before he went home, he drove to my home to tell me, hey, the reason he was telling me that story was like, he knew I was closer to Bala, so I was closer to both. I'm close to both of them, right? Um, and I was actually much closer to Bala, right? I was close, I mean, Mickey, the other guy, was my best friend, but Mickey and the guy weren't as close as Bala and I were close. So it was, um, you know, so this guy was telling me that my best friend was telling me that I should talk to him, that he needs to chill out, that he shouldn't, that cops can actually kill him, because you don't mess with cops in Nigeria. And my best friend especially was very cautious as well, because my best friend had been living in England. I mean, he was always back on holidays. This was a long stay for him. I mean, he lives back in England as well. But back then, he'd been living in England since he was 7, like going back and forth, right? So he for him, he understood the contrast, the difference that it was very jarring for him. That okay, okay, Nigerian cops you have to handle in this way, right? They're extremely corrupt. British cops are different. They're gonna do their jobs, but in the news these days, right? We all hear that British cops are terrible. At least they're sort of like a plague, for women, right? They've been doing terrible things of late. So, cops, this is just what I'm experiencing, especially with my own experience as well, right? Cops they just seem to be terrible everywhere, right? Um, so my friend was basically saying that, look, he was the one who bailed out of that situation because he came out of his car and started prostrating to the cop, saying, "Hey, please, please, please." He started begging, please, and he just gave the cops, the money, and they left. Even though it wasn't his responsibility to give him money because that was illegal, right? The cops could get fired if their bosses knew they were collecting money, bribes, um, you know, from drivers, people who, what do you call people who drive in vehicles, right? For vehicle owners, right? Uh, Instead of doing their jobs at the checkpoint, right? And my friend's papers were in order, so eventually they go. So my friend comes to tell me, and you think that's it. Unfortunately, the story did not end there. Um, that about a few hours later, right? A few hours later, maybe like 3 a.m. Too long. That same night, not too long after. No, the next day. I think it was the next day at night. Next day again at night. My best friend came again, knocked on my door. So at night, I remember my mom heard the noise, because my mom's a light sleeper, and my mom heard it. My mom was pissed that, why this guy, why this is 2 days in a row. So the first day he did it was at night as well. My mom heard him knock, so he's knocking again. My mom's like, okay, hey, what's going on? Because my mom came out. I remember my mom came out, and my mom was like pissed off. Why does he keep coming so late at night? What's going on? So my friend walked in, and he unusual normally, you do the prostrate, but he didn't. He didn't. He just walked past my mom. He looked dazed, and obviously it was wrong. So my mom followed him. We were like, oh, what's going on? Goes into the living room, sits down. He's quiet, and my mom's. So my mom obviously knows that there's something wrong. But I remember my mom was there, and he just opened his mouth. He said, "Bola's dead." I was shocked. I remember my mom had a chewing stick in her mouth. It just dropped. I was like, huh? They were the shock. And by the way, Bola, the same thing. Bola's mom and my mom were friends. Because my mom had been a teacher, so they had been both teachers. I think at the same school one time. They'd both been teachers, and so that's how they knew each other. And then we were neighbors again. They worked at the same place as teachers, and then we were neighbors again. So we lived close to each other, right? So that's how we became friends as well, and we were really close. So I'm like, well, it was shocking. So he was dead. We didn't know how he died. Of course, later on that day, so I went to the house. I went to his house. I tried to find out okay what was going on, and then we heard the whole story. The story, it didn't make sense. First of all, we just, we had the story came out in bits and pieces. Initially in the house because everybody was just shocked and wailing, but it turned out, the mom he hadn't returned home, right? He hadn't returned home that night, and the mom went to the police station to file a missing persons report, and it was shocking, and so later on, the mom was called by the cops to come over that they found her car, and unfortunately, in a very most heinous, um, barbaric fashion, um, they had dumped his body in the boot in the trunk of the car. His corpse was in the trunk of the car. He'd been shot. It was all bloodied, and my friend was a skinny guy, small, skinny, frail. He wasn't, he was a small guy. Very. He wasn't a violent person. He wasn't. He came from a very wealthy home. His father was a very wealthy man, one of the wealthiest. Was a very wealthy man, very prominent man, but he was a very humble guy. Right? He was a very everybody liked him. It was just one of those guys. There's some few people that everybody just likes. Everybody, nobody has something bad to say about them, and he was one of those guys. Everybody just liked him. So it was unusual. This cop who didn't know him was angry with him. But we would learn the story, what happened, because apparently when he went out that night and he was with some other childhood friends, there were females in the car, like his sister's friends, right? And so he was dropping them off, and he had his friends as well. Um, you know, it turned out that I knew some of them. Everybody was in university, right? But it was one of those times that our universities were shut down regularly because of strikes. The situation, people were constantly protesting against, the military dictatorship, students. And so the government would just shut down universities indefinitely. So I remember one of the people told us what happened. So I learned the story. One of the people told us what actually happened. I learned the story from him. And so it turned out after they'd gone off, and my friend came, and my best friend came, they went their separate ways. My friend went out with, the females and the guys. They went off to, um, the pepper soup place. And then, but on their way back, all of a sudden, and they dropped the females first, and my friend was going to drop the other guys. But on their way back, a an unmarked they noticed an unmarked vehicle had been following them. A black vehicle had been following them, and so they thought it was robbers. Because it was Lagos. Armed robbers. They thought it was robbers. So they were pursuing them. So my friend was scared. My friend drove. They kept pursuing them. Eventually, my friend drove into a hospital, right? And that turned out to be a blind alley. So he drove into a hospital hoping that, okay, maybe he'd be able to evade them. But the unmarked vehicle followed them in there, right? Just blocked them, right? Barricaded them in there. And so my friend came down, was being brave, and okay, that he surrenders at whatever it is they want. They don't have they can have the little money they have on them. But as he came down, raising his hands, innocently, he was sprayed. They just gunshots, fire, burst of gunfire. They shot him. Boop, 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 boop. And a bullet hit somebody else in the leg. The three of them, one managed to escape. And with three, one managed to run away. Um, and then it turned out that they called it a Black Maria or something, some kind of police vehicle that cops used to do their patrol. So they put them in the unmarked car, and then they transferred them to a police checkpoint. So they dragged my best friend. He was bloodied. He wasn't dead yet. He'd been shot in the chest. He dragged him, handcuffed him, right? He hadn't committed any crime, nothing, right? Handcuffed him, right? And unfortunately, we had the first-hand story from one of the victims. So they handcuffed him, and then they drove them around. He went on their patrol, right? They took him out of a hospital because he had driven into a hospital. Instead of providing him medical assistance at the hospital, taking him in and having them treat him because he wasn't dead at the time, they put him in their vehicle and took him on their patrol because they would do, the police checkpoints. They had the stationary checkpoints, but they also had a vehicle, right? That was a mobile vehicle that patrolled and moved around. So they took him on their patrol. It handcuffed him. He was all bloodied, dehumanized him, and they were driving him around with the other person. The other friend was, I knew him, right? He went to school with me. He had been shot in the leg. Drove him around, drove both of them. In the end, after hours of patrolling, no medical attention, and they take him to a station, a cell. My friend wasn't a thief. He wasn't a robber. He hadn't committed any crime. That was his vehicle, right? His parents' vehicle. He was driving. That was his car. He wasn't missing nothing. And then they went to lock them in a cell for no reason. They hadn't committed any crime. And I think what's even worse is what's really sad in all the story is that when the mother, right, the mother went to look for him all over in various police stations. So the mother went to the very police station where he'd been locked up in. They put him in a cell, handcuffed him, handcuffed him to a balustrade, right? And the other person put them with criminals. These are people who came from respectable homes. They were university undergraduates, right? Had never committed any crime. They were not criminals. Well, this was just a cop who was trying to get his pound of flesh because he thought my friend um, was refusing to play ball by not giving him a bribe. Right, my idealistic friend. I think what's ironic, in my own situation again, I don't want to really personalize this. I know because there's a prosecutor who did an investigation, and I'm not stupid, right? Uh, the whole swatting that I suffered that the police came, it's in retaliation because I reported senior people in the Department of Defense and Department of the Navy people. I reported them for fraud and misconduct and other things, and they retaliated, and they were doing this to, to discredit me, and to also to obstruct justice, right? So it's illegal, right? I know there are people who've told me what's really going on. It's unfortunate that they used a crazy man, a depraved man like Jide Wari, right? Um, but in any event, uh, my friend had just been idealistic. He wasn't trying to harm anybody. He wasn't trying to. He was a very generous person. Everybody was an extremely generous person. He was very kind. He was humane. He wasn't an aggressive, violent person. He didn't fight. He didn't. No, he was loved. Everybody loved him. He had so many friends, and then they locked him up with criminals, right? And I've experienced this in America. I didn't think I would. I'm not a criminal. I've never committed a crime, right? In fact, I was working in the federal government when the police attacked me in my own home. My family didn't know where I was. So I guess, this was something my mom tried so hard, given what happened to my childhood friend. He tried to make sure I didn't experience something like that. And I never did. I was a grown man when this happened 3 years ago, right? Living independently. And so I can imagine how it felt. My friend had a glimmer of hope when he heard his mother's voice when she came looking for him in the station where he was. He was not yet dead, he was bleeding, he was weak. And he told my friend, he told his friend that was with him that that's his mother. So he thought he was going to live. Help was on the way. He was happy. They said the people in jail with him, the inmates that were, because he was put with criminals, they started yelling so the mom could, to draw the mom's attention for the boy. But for some reason, the cops would wave them away. The cops knew. The cops knew. The cops wanted the boy to die. They wanted the boy to die. So she didn't expect her son would be in jail. She was just filing a missing persons report. So the cops did everything to distract her to make sure she, she couldn't hear the screams saying, Bola is here, Bola is here, Bola is here. It is a very sad story, but it's true. It actually happened. So that moment, my friend had a glimmer of hope that he would be saved. You know, his mom was here. But no, the cops, they were so evil. They were so evil and callous, depraved, morally bankrupt, just like the morally bankrupt ones in Montgomery County, Maryland. So, his mom didn't know. His mom left, right? So his mom left. She filed the missing person report. She had no idea that she was just a few yards away from her son, her dying son. And she had an opportunity to save him, but the cruel cops prevented her. So eventually they called her after he'd passed. And when he'd passed, they put his body in the trunk and told her, oh, they found him. She had to, you can imagine how jarring it was for a mother to see her child in her trunk, in the trunk of her car, right? So that was that. And I remember when we went to see her, she couldn't stop crying. She couldn't stop crying. And, I remember she was looking at me. And you must have been so, like, because somebody who was your friend as a child, you're looking there, wow, her son's gone. You don't know what to do. Um, my mom was there too. I went. It was a very, very terrible experience, extremely terrible experience. I think, but what made things worse was, the father was a prominent man, was a wealthy man. He wanted to get justice, but you learn you can't get justice. You can't, at least in Nigeria, you couldn't get justice. And I'm learning it here in America as well, but I'm going to keep fighting for justice. Unfortunately, when they tried to make it public, the police now sent out disinformation. They made it try and seem like my friend had committed crimes and that they just killed a robber or something. Terrible. That was one. And the other thing, fortunately, he's cleared because they lied. They just fabricated what happened, completely telling lies, maybe talking about guns or what. Just fabricated stuff to defame him, right? Fortunately, though, this story, you can find it on the United Nations website. They did because United Nations did a report on it. So, but I think the parents wanted to try and, get justice against the police, but you can't. The police ended, and the other person that had been shot was alive. The police ended up threatening my friend's family to try and make them back off and not pursue justice. They started threatening them. Then the person who was alive, they told him, intimidated him, threatened that he shouldn't talk to anybody, and they were now trying to kill him. So, in fact, the parents, fortunately, I think they were wealthy, and he had to go abroad, overseas, so they wouldn't kill him, and sort of like assume a new identity, whatever, to make it seem like that man he's been killed, so the police would not try and kill him because he had just witnessed how they just murdered somebody in cold blood. He hadn't done anything, and they were now threatening him, and there was not going to be any justice. So that was Nigeria. That was what we experienced from cops in Nigeria. So that's the reason why I'm very cautious. I don't want to go near police stations. I don't want to go near cops. I don't drive. I don't want to have anything to do with cops. I don't want to get, and especially with the way cops dehumanize black people in America, right? So you want to limit your interactions with them. So it was just a terrible experience that they came to my own home. I was living alone. I was not going through any mental health crisis. It never happened before then, never happened since then. But cops are so stupid, right? At least the ones they're so stupid. They could fabricate all sorts of stuff just to pursue their agenda. In any event, I had this bizarre experience with cops recently, and I realized that, man, how stupid do you have to be to qualify to become a cop? Oh my gosh! But ah, That's a sad story of how cops killed my friend, my childhood friend, and may his soul continue to rest in peace, and may God continue to comfort his family. So um, I'm not a fan of you know cops, and I never knew that they would almost come and kill me as well, and then fabricate and frame me and defame me. They're monsters.